Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is a journey into a quieter corner of the past, where stories are not loud with battles or victories, but soft with the small rituals that came before an ending. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so that these forgotten histories can drift a little farther, maybe even reaching others in your family who need a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see those tiny lights glowing on a map across the world, each one of you listening quietly, together, though apart. Now, let's begin. The Oregon Trail never truly began with the rattle of wheels or the snapping of reins. It began in silence, in the fragile hours before dawn, when the air still carried the weight of yesterday and the promise of something distant, unnamed. Imagine a field outside a small frontier town, still wrapped in mist, where the wagons sit like slumbering animals. They wait in rows, heavy with supplies, with canvas tops curved like the backs of whales, catching the faintest glimmers of a new sun. Around them, families move quietly, almost reverently, as though they understand that this morning is more than a departure. It is the start of a slow unraveling of everything familiar. The first sound is often a low murmur, someone whispering instructions, someone else coaxing a child out of sleep. Then the voices layer, rising like soft threads in the air. Pots clink faintly as mothers stir last cups of coffee or tea over embers. Children tug at boots too stiff with yesterday's dust, and men check the leather straps of oxen harnesses with hands already worn from days of preparation. The trail, even in these first minutes, is less about motion than about waiting. Waiting for light, waiting for courage, waiting for the wagons to creak forward into the unknown. No one speaks of fear, but it lingers, unspoken, in the stillness. A journey westward is not only miles to be crossed, but the slow surrender of certainty. Towns left behind vanish like echoes, and ahead lies a geography only half dreamed. Some have studied maps, hand-drawn sketches pass from one traveler to another, but most know only what they have heard, that beyond the plains are rivers, mountains, valleys, and finally a place called Oregon, where soil is dark, rains are steady, and the promise of life is richer than in the thinning earth of the east. In the half-light, the oxen are restless. Their broad shoulders heave as they stamp against the chill, their breath drifting like steam. Horses nicker, mules bray, a few dogs bark too loudly, startling the younger children who cling to their mothers' skirts. The caravan feels alive before it moves, as though the trail itself has already claimed it. A father lifts his child into the wagon, settling them atop crates packed with flour, salt pork, dried beans, and sacks of cornmeal, barrels of water, pickled vegetables, iron pots, axes, rifles, all stacked tightly, every inch of space precious. Quilts, folded carefully, double as bedding and insulation. Beneath the canvas, the wagon is less a vehicle and more a fragile house on wheels, carrying a family's entire world westward. The creak of its wooden frame is a reminder that everything within it rests on the mercy of the trail. As dawn seeps through the mist, colors return to the world. The faint pink of the sky, the deep brown of earth, the pale white of wagon covers. Faces, lined with both excitement and dread, begin to sharpen in the new light. It is not a hurried departure. The trail does not allow for haste. Wheels are inspected once more, tongues adjusted, grease applied to axles, ropes tightened. Every gesture is deliberate, because each step west is a gamble, and small mistakes can bloom into calamity days or weeks later. When the first wagon rolls forward, it is almost hesitant, as if reluctant to break the stillness of morning. Its wheels crunch softly over the grass, carving the first line of what will become an endless scar stretching westward. Others follow, one by one, until the field becomes a slow river of motion, canvas tops bobbing, animals straining, voices calling. The trail, once empty, begins to breathe. Children peer from wagon openings, their eyes wide at the sight of the horizon swallowing their old town. Some wave to neighbours left behind, though the distance between them grows quickly. For those who stay, the wagons are both a marvel and a sorrow, evidence of hope, but also of loss. Every departure leaves behind echoes of friendship, familiar laughter, and the certainty of shared lives. For those leaving, the only path is forward, where the road unfolds into distances no one can yet measure. The pace is slow, deliberately so. Oxen are not swift creatures, but they are steady, and steadiness is the lifeblood of the trail. Wagons rumble and tilt, their iron rims biting into soft earth. Dust rises, even in these early miles, carried into the air by hooves and wheels, settling into hair, clothing, and skin. Travelers quickly learn that dust is not a momentary inconvenience. It will be a constant companion, clinging to every surface, seasoning every meal, filling every breath. The sound of the caravan becomes its own kind of music. The creak of wood, the slap of reins, the low calls of teamsters urging their animals forward. Somewhere, a fiddle plays. One man, unwilling to let silence consume him, draws out a tune that blends with the rhythm of hooves. Laughter follows, though softly, as though travelers are afraid to disturb the fragile contract they have made with the land. The trail is not empty. Already, other groups move westward, their wagons scattered across the horizon like pale sails on an inland sea. Some have left weeks earlier, others only yesterday. Strangers nod as they pass, exchanging fragments of advice. Which river crossings are shallow, which patches of grass are still green, where storms have gathered. These brief encounters are lifelines, tiny bridges between families, though each caravan remains its own fragile universe, bound together by the weight of shared dependence. As the sun climbs higher, the first challenges emerge. Wheels sink slightly into softer ground, requiring men to shoulder against spokes and push. Axles groan. A barrel, poorly tied, rolls loose and is caught just before it shatters against the earth. These are not disasters, but they are reminders. The trail wastes no time in teaching its lessons: caution, patience, vigilance. Around midday, the wagons halt. The animals, sweating and weary already, need rest. Oxen lower their heads into patches of grass, chewing slowly, while families spread blankets on the ground. Simple meals: hardtack softened in water, slices of cured meat, a few dried apples, are eaten with more gratitude than taste. The wind carries the smell of grass and earth, mingled with the smoke of small fires where coffee is boiled. Even here, even so early, there is an understanding that meals will grow plainer, supplies thinner, but for now, there is enough. Conversations drift in quiet tones. Some speak of the land ahead, of rivers said to run wide as seas, of mountains sharp against the sky. Others recall the towns they left behind, their voices heavy with longing. Children chase one another between wagons, their laughter momentarily lifting the heaviness of the journey. Dogs bark, tails wagging, as if the trail were no more than an extended game. By afternoon, the wagons creak forward again, shadows lengthening with the angle of the sun. The horizon stretches endlessly, a shifting line that seems always out of reach. Step by step, mile by mile, the trail reminds its travelers of scale, the vastness of land, the smallness of human ambition. Yet it also whispers of possibility, of soil rich enough to anchor new lives, of a future not yet written. Evening comes slowly, with the sky painted in long strokes of gold and violet. The wagons circle for the first camp, forming a loose ring that serves both as shelter and as symbol. Within the circle, fires flicker, their smoke rising into the deepening dusk. Animals are unhitched and tethered, their heavy bodies finally allowed to rest. Around the fires, families settle into rhythms, cooking stews from beans and salt pork, telling stories, mending clothes by firelight. The night feels different from the morning. It is heavier, as though the day has carved its weight into every muscle and thought. Yet, it is also a night alive with the first sense of belonging to the trail. Crickets sing in the grass, Owls call from the trees. And above, the sky opens with stars so thick it seems one could scoop them with a hand. Some whisper prayers, others simply listen to the silence between sounds, the hum of the prairie, the steady breathing of animals asleep nearby. Children curl against quilts, their faces smudged with dust, their dreams carrying the somewhere between the life they left and the one they have not yet reached. Parents sit longer, staring into the flames, their minds restless with both worry and hope. For them, the trail is not only a road, but a reckoning. Each step forward a choice that cannot be undone. The wagons, silent now, stand like pale sentinels in the moonlight. Their wooden frames groan softly in the cooling air, their shadows stretching across the grass. They are no longer waiting. They have begun. And with them, the people within have entered a story larger than themselves. A story written in dust and distance, in hunger and hope, in the endless rhythm of wheels against earth. The first day on the Oregon Trail does not end with arrival, for there is no arrival, not yet. It ends with a circle of light in the darkness, a fragile claim against the vast unknown, and the steady knowledge that tomorrow, when the sun rises again, the wheels will turn once more. The morning after that first circle of wagons, the trail stretches forward like an unwound ribbon, long and uncertain, disappearing into horizons no eye can measure. Families rise with the faint light, their quilts damp with dew, their limbs stiff from hard ground. Fires are coaxed back to life with the patient strike of flint, and once again the smell of coffee drifts faintly over the prairie. The wagons are drawn into motion, their wheels pressing new grooves beside yesterday's tracks, and the land, wide and endless, opens itself in all directions. For most travelers, there is no compass but rumor, no guide but the lines drawn on paper maps that fold clumsily in the hand. These maps, passed from one family to another in towns before departure, are more dream than reality. Sketches drawn by men who saw part of the trail and imagined the rest. A line here for a river, a jagged edge there for mountains, empty spaces left where no one dared to guess. To the hopeful, they seem like promises, pathways inked with certainty. But as the wagons roll further into the vastness, the travelers discover that paper does not hold the land, it only flatters it. Unfolding one of these maps at midday, under a sun that seems to pour itself endlessly across the plains, a father studies the black marks with squinting eyes. The trail is drawn like a child's line in the dirt, steady and simple, stretching neatly west. Yet before him lies no such clarity, just grasses that ripple like oceans, rivers that wander where they please, and distances that cannot be measured in neat strokes of ink. He sighs, folding the paper back into his coat. The map can tell him where to point his oxen, but not what waits between here and there. The children, less concerned with maps, stare out at a world that seems to shift with every mile. To them, the land is an endless game, a place where stones sparkle like treasure, where prairie dogs dart into hidden tunnels, where birds circle high against a sky too big to hold in their small eyes. Their laughter runs ahead of the wagons, chasing shadows, until their mothers call them back, warning that the trail is wider than their play. Still, the maps remain a comfort, folded neatly inside pockets and saddlebags. Each evening, when the wagons circle again, and the firelight flickers against the canvas, someone pulls out a map and traces the line with a calloused finger. Here, they murmur, we must be somewhere near here. But the prairie does not answer, and the stars, though brilliant, give no easy reassurance. The trail has its own cartography, one written not on paper, but in fatigue, in rivers crossed, in ruts carved into soil by wheels that have passed before. In towns back east, men had spoken confidently of these maps. They described the trail as if it were a road already built, as if one could simply follow the ink and arrive at destiny. The sellers of land, of tools, of supplies, repeated the same stories with a knowing smile, that the way west was charted, that rivers could be forded easily, that mountains were distant but passable. Each line on the paper carried the weight of persuasion, urging families to trade their homes for a promise drawn in fragile ink. But on the ground, the truth unravels differently. A river drawn as a thin curve on the page is in reality a restless body of water that shifts with storms, swelling and shrinking as it pleases. Mountains marked with a simple jagged stroke are far more than peaks. They are ranges that fold the sky into stone, ridges that demand weeks of climbing and descent. And the blank spaces where the mapmaker's pen refused to wander are not emptiness at all, but wide plains where wind howls endlessly, or forests so dense the sun itself seems to vanish. Some travelers cling to these maps with almost religious devotion. They unfold them at every turn, measuring steps, arguing over bends in the trail. Others, disillusioned already, tuck them away, preferring to follow the ruts left by earlier wagons, those shallow scars pressed into the earth by strangers who gambled their lives weeks or months before. These ruts are more reliable than paper. They are the true language of the trail, written not in ink, but in dust, wood, and bone. At midday, when the sun burns directly overhead and shadows vanish, the caravan pauses again. Mothers fan their children with scraps of cloth. Oxen lower themselves into the dirt, chewing patiently. A group of men gathers around a map spread across a barrel, their brows furrowed, their fingers tracing lines that refuse to align with what they see. One insists that a river should have appeared by now. Another argues that they may have wandered too far north. The argument fades into silence when a boy points eastward where dust rises in the distance. Another train of wagons approaches, and with them, perhaps, news of what lies ahead. When the strangers arrive, their faces streaked with days of travel, they carry no maps at all. Instead, they offer stories. The river is still many days' journey, they say, and the grass grows thinner the further west one goes. They describe storms that had rolled across the plains, lightning splitting the sky, winds flattening tents and fires. Their words become the new guide, more vivid than ink, more trustworthy than the fragile folds of paper. Maps, in their silence, cannot tell such stories. Night falls again, and the wagons form their circle. Fires crackle, throwing orange light against the pale canvas tops. Someone holds a map close to the flames, tracing the dark line once more. But now the gesture feels almost like ritual, a habit kept not for its truth, but for its comfort. The line on the page may promise direction, but the trail itself demands faith in more immediate things. The strength of oxen, the judgment of scouts, the watchfulness of fathers and mothers who keep their children close. The stars above sprawl across the black sky, brighter than any lantern. If one were to stretch a hand upward, it might seem possible to draw new maps there, to connect the points of light into rivers and mountains of a different kind. But the people gathered by the fires know better. The sky has always been mapped, yet its constellations remain far removed from the ground they must cross. It is the land itself, its mud, its dust, its restless waters, that writes the true map of this journey. As families drift into uneasy sleep, their wagons standing guard in the moonlight, the folded papers lie quiet in saddlebags and coat pockets. They will be pulled out again tomorrow, studied, doubted, perhaps even cursed. But in the hush of the prairie night, it is clear that the maps have already given too much, and not enough. They promise certainty, but the trail offers only movement, and so the wheels will turn again, not toward lines on a page, but toward the immeasurable sweep of land that refuses to be contained by ink. The wagons groan softly as the wind moves through them, the oxen shifting in their sleep. Beyond the circle of firelight, the prairie rolls into darkness without end, carrying the travelers deeper into its silence. And somewhere ahead, unseen, the trail waits, unwritten, unfolding one weary mile at a time. The wheels turn slowly, their wooden rims grinding against the earth, leaving deep impressions in soil softened by last night's dew. They creak with a rhythm that becomes the heartbeat of the trail, a sound that weaves itself into every step, every pause, every breath taken beneath the wide prairie sky. Each wagon is more than timber and iron. It is a vessel swollen with the weight of an entire household's past and future, rattling forward in steady defiance of the unknown. Before the journey began, back in the small towns at the edge of the frontier, there had been decisions that felt heavier than any barrel or crate. Families stood before piles of possessions, measuring them not in worth, but in necessity. Chairs that had held generations, tables marked with the scratches of countless meals, books that had gathered dust in lamplight. One by one, they were set aside. The wagons could not carry sentiment. They could only carry what the land demanded: flour, cornmeal, salted meat, rifles, blankets, spare wheels, and iron tools. The rest was left behind, given away or abandoned, ghosts of a former life. Still, within the canvas-curved bellies of the wagons, dreams hid in the quiet corners. A mother tucked away a porcelain teacup, wrapped in cloth, its delicate shape reminding her of mornings spent in kitchens far from here. A child carried a wooden toy horse, its paint chipped, but its presence a small anchor against the strangeness of open land. A father hid his family Bible under layers of provisions, its pages already worn thin, believing that words might shield them more than powder or steel. As the oxen pulled, the wheels bore the strain of these hidden treasures, their spokes flexing under weight that was not only physical but imagined. Each creak of the axle seemed to voice the hopes stacked within, the hope of fertile soil, of steady rain, of a house yet unbuilt, where laughter might one day echo. The trail was measured not just in miles, but in the fragile persistence of these unspoken promises. The children, peering out from beneath the canvas flaps, often wondered why their wagons seemed to move slower than their restless legs wished. They did not understand the weight pressing on those wheels, the barrels of water that sloshed with every rut, the sacks of beans and flour stacked like bricks of survival, the iron pots and kettles that clanged against one another with each jolt. To them, the wagons were castles rolling across a kingdom of grass, their shadows stretching like banners behind them. But to the parents, every sound from within carried consequence. The shifting of crates, the crack of a jar, the ominous groan of strained wood. The prairie itself seemed to test the wagons, as though curious to see what these wooden beasts carried. Rocks, hidden beneath tall grass, jolted the wheels, sending ripples of alarm through the cargo. Streams, shallow yet uneven, forced the drivers to wade in, guiding wheels across stones slick with moss. Even the wind played its part, pushing against the canvas covers until they billowed like sails, tugging at ropes, testing knots. At camp, when the circle of wagons closed for the night, the work of unpacking began. Children scrambled to fetch smaller items, buckets, tin cups, the toy tucked away under a quilt, while mothers arranged the evening meal from supplies measured out with strict precision. Flour became simple bread, beans were softened into stew, and coffee was rationed carefully, its aroma lifting spirits more than its taste could satisfy. Fathers inspected the wheels, tightening iron rims, greasing axles, replacing pins before they could snap. The wagons, though still, were never free from labor. They demanded constant tending, as if reminding their owners that carrying dreams came at a price. In the hush between chores, when fires crackled and the prairie darkened into silence, stories drifted among the wagons. Some spoke of friends who had made it west already, building cabins near rivers that promised steady harvests. Others whispered of families who had lost too much on the trail, wagons broken, oxen dead, supplies abandoned in haste. These stories were measured against the creak of wheels in memory, and each family held tighter to their own fragile cargo. Children often fell asleep to the lullaby of those wheels, the sound lingering in their ears even when the wagons rested. For them, the wooden groan became as familiar as their mothers' voices, a reminder that movement was constant, that each morning would bring another stretch of horizon. They dreamed of wagons not as burdens, but as companions. Slow, loyal animals with curved white backs and unshakable patience. By day, the line of wagons stretched far, each one following the narrow ruts left by those before. To walk beside them was to feel the dust rise in clouds, to hear the iron rims strike against stone, to taste the dryness of the trail with every breath. And yet, In the repetition of sound and motion, there was comfort. The wagons were steady when everything else felt uncertain. They marked progress in their endless turning, their shadows slowly shifting as the sun moved across the sky. Not every wheel survived unscathed. A sharp stone could splinter wood, a hidden rut could jar an axle. When such things happened, the caravan halted, and hands gathered quickly, lifting, bracing, replacing. Spare parts, carried carefully from the start, were fitted into place. A broken wheel meant delay, and delay meant dwindling supplies, so the repair became a ritual of urgency. Children watched wide-eyed as fathers and neighbors worked together, their tools striking sparks in the sun, their sweat dripping into dust. When at last the wheel turned again, there was a quiet cheer, as if the trail itself had relented. Some wagons bore marks of hardship already, canvas patched where wind had torn it, boards darkened with the stain of spilled molasses, wheels worn smooth by endless friction. Others carried faint decorations, initials carved into the wood, flowers stitched into the canvas by a careful hand. In these small details, each wagon revealed its family, its identity, its stubborn individuality in a sea of near-identical shapes. The prairie swallowed all of it, holding no judgment, only silence. Grass bent beneath the wheels, then straightened once the caravan passed. Birds circled above, indifferent to the creak of axles. Rivers swallowed the reflection of wagons crossing, then rippled back into stillness. Only the ruts, carved deeper each day, remained as testament, lines pressed into the land like signatures that could not be erased. In the evenings, when sleep settled unevenly across the camp, the wagons stood in their ring like guardians. Their shadows stretched under moonlight, their wheels silent yet poised, as if waiting for dawn. The canvas tops gleamed faintly, pale against the dark sky, resembling sails waiting for wind. They were more than machines. They were companions, shelters, burdens, and promises all at once. The trail was long, and the land was vast, but every mile pressed into those wheels carried something more than distance. It carried the persistence of families who had surrendered nearly everything to fit within wooden frames, who believed that somewhere beyond the horizon, their wagons would finally stop, not from breaking, but because they had arrived. Until then, the wheels would turn, carrying not just food, tools, and blankets, but the fragile dreams of lives yet to be lived. And so the wagons moved onward, their creaks and groans folding into the quiet music of the trail, their wooden hearts echoing across the plains. Each spoke, each rim, each axle bore not just weight but longing. And though the prairie gave no promises, the wheels carried them forward, endlessly westward, into the silence of tomorrow. The wagons pressed onward, their wheels carving slow lines into the earth. Yet behind them trailed something unseen, heavier than the cargo stacked beneath the canvas. Each family carried with them a silence that was not born of the prairie, but of memory. For even as the land stretched wide and strange before them, homes still clung to their minds. The places where roots had once held firm, where doorways framed familiar faces, where the air itself seemed gentler because it was known. The Oregon Trail was not only a road into the future, it was an unraveling of the past, and the act of leaving was never finished in a single moment. Every mile became another quiet farewell. The children, still restless with curiosity, sometimes asked when they would see their old town again, and the parents answered with silence, or with words that did not reach the truth. For the truth was that home had already faded, receding with every turn of the wheel, yet refusing to vanish entirely. At night, around the campfires, the conversations often wandered backward. A man spoke of the fields he once ploughed, their furrows etched into his muscles as much as into the soil. A woman described the warmth of a kitchen hearth, the way the morning light had filtered through lace curtains stitched by her mother. Someone else remembered the creak of church pews, the sound of hymns rising together beneath a low wooden roof. These recollections drifted like smoke into the air, joining the stars, fading quickly but leaving behind their faint trace. It It was not only buildings and land that were left behind, but the fabric of community. Neighbors who had shared tools, shared bread, shared grief. Now their faces lived only in memory. The trail was full of strangers, and though bonds would form, they could never quite replace the easy familiarity of a voice calling from across a fence. Even as new friendships sparked along the wagons, the absence of the old ones ached like a phantom limb. The younger children, too small to understand permanence, often played make-believe of their former lives. They pretended the prairie grass was a yard, that wagon wheels were fences, that the firelight was the warm glow of their kitchen lamps. Their games carried a bitter sweetness, as though their imaginations built fragile bridges back to what was gone. Parents watched, smiling faintly, though their eyes betrayed the sorrow of knowing those bridges could never truly be crossed again. The trail itself seemed to echo this departure. The further west the wagons rolled, the less familiar the landscape became. The trees grew different, their bark rougher, their shapes unfamiliar. Birds sang songs not heard in eastern mornings. Even the wind seemed altered, carrying scents of grasses and soils that spoke of distance. Every change in the land was another reminder that home had been exchanged for something vast and uncertain. Some travelers carried tokens to hold the memory closer. A woman wore a locket with a curl of her mother's hair, touching it when the night grew heavy. A boy clutched a stone from the riverbank near his old house, rubbing its smooth surface as he walked beside the wagon. A man carried seeds in a pouch, determined to plant them in Oregon soil, as though he could coax the past into sprouting again in the future. These objects became quiet talismans, threads tying them to a place that grew fainter with each sunrise. Yet, for all the sorrow of leaving, there was also a strange kind of relief. Some had left behind debts they could never pay, fields too barren to feed a family, towns where opportunity had withered into nothing more than survival. The goodbye, though heavy, carried with it the faint lifting of a burden. The trail for them was not only an escape from familiarity, but a chance to shed the weight of failure. Home, once a place of comfort, had become a place of struggle, and stepping away was its own form of mercy. The long goodbye was not spoken all at once, but lingered in fragments, in memories that surfaced unexpectedly. A father, waking to the smell of damp grass, suddenly thought of the barn he had built with his own hands, its roof patched with care, its stalls filled with the breath of animals he had left behind. A mother, sewing by firelight, recalled the sound of her sister's laughter as they once worked together in the same soft glow. These memories came unbidden, like visitors who appeared without knocking and stayed only long enough to remind them of absence. Even as they moved further into the unknown, there were moments when the past and present seemed to blur. A distant hill might resemble the ridge near their old farm. The cry of a bird might echo the sound that once woke them each morning. In those brief instants, they felt suspended between two worlds, the one they had left and the one they sought. And the trail itself became a long corridor where echoes followed but never quite reached them. The goodbyes extended beyond people and places. They reached into rhythms, into habits so ordinary that their absence was felt like a hollow space. The toll of a church bell marking the hours, the chatter of markets on Saturday mornings, the creak of floorboards beneath familiar steps. These small details lived now only in memory. On the trail, time was marked instead by the sun and the distance between water sources. The sounds were the groan of wagons, the bray of mules, the endless whisper of wind. Home was no longer a structure, but an ache woven into the body. As the days stretched on, the travelers learned that goodbye is not a single act, but a process that unfolds with every step. They left their homes once when the wagons first rolled out of town. They left them again when they crossed the first wide river, when the horizon stretched so far that no memory could measure it, when the nights grew colder and the stars seemed sharper. Each mile westward was another layer peeled away, until the homes they had known became not just distant, but almost dreamlike, as though they belonged to another life entirely. And yet, even as those homes faded, the trail itself began to offer a new kind of belonging. The circle of wagons at night became its own village, the fires its hearths, the stars its roof. Neighbours were no longer separated by fences, but by the spaces between wagons. Children grew accustomed to the sound of wheels and hooves instead of bells and doors. Slowly, the memory of home shifted. Not gone, but softened, less sharp, less urgent. The goodbye, long and reluctant, was being spoken not just in sorrow, but in acceptance. When the prairie winds swept across the camp, carrying the smell of grass and smoke, the travelers sometimes closed their eyes and imagined they were back in the places they had left. But when they opened them, the truth was always there. A sky too large to be framed by walls, a land too wide to be contained by fences, and wagons waiting patiently for another day's journey. The long goodbye was still unfinished, but it carried them forward step by step until the trail itself became the only home they knew. The wagons rolled on, their wooden frames groaning beneath the weight of lives carried westward. With every turn of the wheels, the earth lifted in pale clouds that hung in the air before settling on hair, on clothing, on the creases of tired faces. Dust became the trail's constant companion, as inescapable as the sky itself. It coated the tongue until water seemed to turn to mud inside the mouth, and it clung to the lashes so that every blink became a quiet effort. This dust was not the sharp sting of storms, nor the violent roar of winds. It was gentler, more patient, a slow, creeping presence that worked itself into everything. It sifted into the folds of blankets, found its way into flour sacks, settled in the small cracks between boards. Children coughed lightly in the evenings, their voices raspy not from sickness, but from breathing the trail itself. Mothers tried to shake it from clothing, fathers brushed it from tools. Yet by morning, it had returned, as though the land insisted on marking all who travelled across it. The horizon stretched before them without mercy. It was not broken by steeples or roofs, not softened by forests or the curve of familiar hills. Instead, it stretched in one long line, a meeting of sky and earth so distant it seemed unreachable. The travellers learned quickly that the horizon was both companion and tormentor. Each day it appeared before them, unchanged, always promising that something might lie just beyond, yet always retreating as the wheels creaked closer. The animals, too, grew weary of the endless sameness. Oxen plodded with heads bowed low, their hides streaked with sweat and dust. Horses snorted, shaking their manes in frustration. Even the dogs that followed the wagons seemed subdued, their barks muffled by exhaustion. The landscape offered little to distract the eye. Grass bent with the wind, then straightened again. Small birds darted briefly across the air, only to vanish into the vastness. It was a world that repeated itself so faithfully that time began to blur. For the families walking beside their wagons, days folded into one another like pages with the same words written over and over. The sky turned pale with morning, then burned with midday sun, then softened into the muted glow of dusk. The pattern repeated so steadily that one could forget how many days had passed. Sometimes travellers spoke of distance, not in miles, but in measures of the sun. 3 sunsets since the last stream, 5 sunrises until the next landmark. The road erased clocks and calendars, replacing them with the rhythm of light and shadow. Children tried to amuse themselves by searching the horizon for shapes. They pointed out clouds that resembled ships or castles, animals that seemed to float above the prairie. Their laughter carried briefly before being swallowed by the open air. Adults, less easily distracted, watched the land with a heavier gaze. They noted how the soil shifted colour, how the grasses grew shorter, how the wind carried hints of rain or drought. They watched for signs of change, for some small difference that would promise progress. And yet, within this monotony, something strange took root. There were moments when the endless road seemed less like a burden and more like a kind of trance. The steady crunch of footsteps, the creak of wheels, the low hum of wind. It became a rhythm that lulled the mind into stillness. Travellers spoke less, not out of silence, but out of surrender to the pattern. Thoughts drifted inward, memories rose and fell, dreams mingled with the waking landscape. The trail itself became a long meditation, where the mind wandered as far as the wagons. The dust and the horizon wove together into something almost unreal. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, the sun turned the air golden, and the particles of earth shimmered like faint sparks. The sky deepened, stretching out so far that it seemed to swallow sound. In those moments, the travelers felt both impossibly small and impossibly free, as though they had slipped out of the boundaries of ordinary life. The monotony carried with it not only weariness, but a strange sense of awe. Still, hardship lay in every breath. The dust-dried lips until they cracked, eyes burned, skin grew raw, clothes grew heavy with grime. Water was guarded like treasure, rationed in careful sips. Meals, once shared at wooden tables in quiet homes, were now eaten with hands stained from the road, the taste of earth never fully absent. Yet no one turned back. The horizon, endless though it was, whispered a promise that could not be ignored. Sometimes the monotony was broken by sudden sights that startled the travelers into wakefulness. A herd of buffalo in the distance, their dark shapes moving like shadows across the grass. A solitary tree, standing tall against the emptiness, its branches spread like a signal from the land itself. A river glinting in the sun, cutting across the plains like a silver ribbon. These sights brought relief, even joy, reminding the weary that the world was not only dust and sameness. At night, when the wagons circled and fires flickered low, the dust still lingered, settling softly on faces as families slept. The horizon disappeared into darkness, yet its presence was felt even then. The sky above stretched farther than the eye could grasp, a canvas of stars so thick it seemed as though the heavens themselves leaned close to watch. The road might vanish in shadow, but the sense of endlessness remained, both comforting and unsettling. As the weeks wore on, the travelers learned to live with the dust, to accept the horizon as part of their days. Scarves were tied around faces, water carefully poured over cloth to keep the air bearable, hands scrubbed until they bled only to be coated again within the hour. The monotony became less an enemy and more a condition of existence, something endured rather than fought. In its own way, the trail was teaching them how to let go, of comfort, of cleanliness, of the illusions of control. What remained, after the dust and the distance stripped so much away, was a strange resilience. Children no longer complained of the sameness, but learned to chase insects or carve small toys from bits of wood. Parents walked with quieter steps, conserving energy for the long days, but their eyes carried a determination that dust could not cloud. The horizon, unreachable though it seemed, had become their guide. It pulled them forward, not because it promised an end, but because it gave direction in a world that might otherwise have swallowed them whole. In the long silence of the road, the families discovered something few had expected, that even in the face of endless dust and horizons that never yielded, the human spirit could adapt. The road had taken their homes, their comforts, and their familiar rhythms, but it had also given them a strange endurance, a way of moving forward through sameness without surrender. The dust might choke, the horizon might deceive, but the wagons still rolled, carrying dreams as stubborn as the road itself. The Oregon Trail was not only a passage through land, but a passage through time and endurance. Each step carried with it both the weight of the past and the pull of what lay ahead. The dust clung, the horizon stretched, and in between, the travelers moved slowly, endlessly, toward a future that shimmered just out of reach. When the wagons at last slowed, and the sun fell behind the wide plains, the prairie softened into its evening voice. The endless road that had consumed the daylight hours gave way to a different kind of world, one not marked by dust and creaking wheels, but by the fragile glow of fire against open darkness. The day's noise, hooves striking hard soil, wheels rumbling over uneven ground, children's shouts swallowed by wind, dissolved into stillness, broken only by the low crackle of wood kindling to flame. Campfires became the center of the trail's nights, fragile circles of light in a land that knew no boundaries. Around them, families drew close, pressing into the warmth as the prairie winds swept over their shoulders. The fire was more than heat. It was safety, a symbol that in this vast expanse they could still carve out a place where they belonged. In the silence of the open plain, the flickering flames gave the illusion of walls, a temporary home built out of smoke and sparks. The prairie wind, ever restless, was both companion and adversary. It hissed across the grasses, rattled the canvas of wagons, pulled at the flames until they bent sideways like fragile reeds. Sometimes it arrived gentle, brushing cheeks with cool relief after the heat of the day. Other times it roared without warning, scattering embers, forcing men to shield the fire with their bodies, hats pressed low against their brows. The fire survived either way, clinging stubbornly to life, much like the travelers themselves. Meals were simple, but the fire transformed them into something more than sustenance. Cornmeal stirred into thick cakes, beans simmered slowly, strips of salted meat softened by heat. None of it luxurious, yet beneath the stars, each bite felt earned. Mothers measured rations carefully, stretching what little remained, while fathers cut wood for tomorrow's fire, knowing the prairie did not always grant fuel easily. Children watched the flames dance, their faces illuminated in shades of gold, their weariness momentarily forgotten. Around the fires, voices rose again, softer now than in the light of day. Stories were told, sometimes of home, sometimes of legends carried westward. An old man might recall his youth by another hearth far away, his words drifting into the night like smoke. A mother might hum a lullaby, her song carried gently across the grass. Laughter surfaced occasionally, startling in its brightness against the stillness. Even sorrow was shared here, spoken into the fire as though its warmth could soften grief. For all the hardship of the road, the campfires revealed something enduring, the need for connection. Strangers who had joined the trail separately found themselves seated side by side, passing food, trading tales, and watching sparks lift into the sky. In those small gatherings, communities formed, not permanent ones perhaps, but strong enough to weather the night. Tomorrow the road would pull them forward again, scattering them into distance. But for the span of a few hours, they belonged to one another. The prairie itself listened. Coyotes cried faintly in the distance, their voices rising like broken songs. Insects hummed in endless patterns, blending with the whistle of wind through dry grass. Horses shifted restlessly at the edge of the firelight, their eyes reflecting small points of flame. Beyond the circle of warmth, the night stretched into mystery, its vastness both frightening and strangely peaceful. The stars above burned so brightly they seemed close enough to touch, each one a reminder of how far the travelers had come from the sheltered nights of their former homes. There was a rhythm to these evenings, as steady as the march of the days. Fires built, meals shared, voices lifted, silence settling. The repetition itself became comforting. Children came to expect the glow after long miles, and even the weary grown found relief in the ritual. Some nights, the fires burned brighter, fueled by dry wood and high spirits. Other nights, they struggled against dampness or wind, dwindling quickly into smoke. Yet no matter how small the flame, it was enough to hold back the dark. And the dark was vast. Without the walls of towns or the cover of forests, the prairie nights stretched endlessly. Sleep did not come easily to all. Parents lay awake listening to the wind rattle wagon wheels, half wondering if it carried more than just air. They thought of animals beyond the firelight, or of strangers whose footsteps might one day cross theirs. Others, too exhausted to worry, sank into sleep quickly, their breaths rising and falling with the crackle of embers. In every camp, watch was kept, eyes trained on both flame and shadow, for fire was safety only so long as it remained alive. Yet for all the unease, there were moments of quiet wonder. Children, restless before sleep, gazed at the constellations their parents pointed out. Orion, the Great Bear, the endless river of the Milky Way. Stories stretched across the sky, just as surely as the wagons stretched across the land. The prairie made the heavens vast, but the fires reminded them that light could be carried even into the deepest dark. Sometimes, the wind carried scents with it, faint reminders of other lives. Smoke from distant camps reached the nostrils before the fires themselves were seen, proof that they were not alone on the trail. The knowledge brought both comfort and unease. To see another fire burning far across the plain was to know that others endured the same dust, the same wind, the same long nights. It was also to know that in this open land, strangers were never far away. The prairie wind, for all its mischief, offered its own gift. It carried away the heat of the day, brushed sweat from tired brows, and whispered through the grasses like a voice without words. Some nights it sang, high and thin. Other nights it drummed low and steady. The travelers grew accustomed to its moods, finding in them a strange companionship. The fire and the wind became nightly partners, one clinging to the earth, the other rushing across it, together shaping the fragile boundary between human presence and the wilderness. As the fires burned low, the camp settled into silence. Children curled beneath blankets, their cheeks smudged with ash. Mothers folded clothing for another day. Fathers stoked the last embers, ensuring enough glow remained to light the first tasks of morning. The wind, too, seemed to soften, as if respecting the slumber of those who had endured its force all day. In the fading crackle of flame, dreams mingled with reality, both fragile and fleeting as smoke itself. In time, the travelers came to measure their journey not only by miles or rivers, but by nights around the fire. Each camp became a marker, a memory carried forward. The night the wind nearly took the flames, the night a coyote wandered too close, the night the stars seemed to outnumber the grains of sand. In these fragile circles of warmth, the Oregon Trail revealed not just hardship, but the quiet persistence of human life, carving light into the vast, restless dark of the prairie. By the time the campfires faded and the wagons creaked back onto the long road, the trail itself began to reveal its other travelers. It was not only the endless horizon or the restless wind that kept them company. Across that vast expanse, other wagons moved steadily westward, their canvas tops catching the sunlight, their wheels cutting grooves into the earth. Strangers appeared and disappeared like passing shadows, each carrying their own burdens, their own hopes, their own unspoken stories. At first, the meetings were brief, nothing more than a nod exchanged between families as they crossed paths. A man would tip his hat, a child would wave shyly, oxen would snort in recognition of their kind. Yet the trail had a way of stretching days into something heavier, and the presence of others became a comfort too valuable to ignore. Soon, voices rose between wagons, and stories began to spill across the dust. It started simply, questions about distance, about rivers crossed, about whether the grass ahead was better for grazing. Practical matters, spoken in the measured tones of survival. But as the miles passed and the evenings deepened, words carried further. Travelers leaned against wagon wheels, sharing more than directions. They spoke of where they had come from, of farms left behind, of towns that now seemed as distant as dreams. Strangers became familiar by the act of telling, their lives etched into memory through the fragile gift of story. There was comfort in realizing that hardship was not born alone. One man described the sickness that had taken 2 of his children, his voice quiet but steady, and others nodded, not with pity, but with the grim recognition of those who had also felt loss. Another told of a fire that had consumed his barn the year before, pushing him westward in search of renewal. Some spoke of debts that could not be paid, of harvests that failed, of letters unanswered. Around the fire, these stories mingled until it was hard to tell where one life ended and another began. Children, too, found new friends along the trail. Their laughter carried across campsites, bridging the distance between families. They traded small treasures, smooth stones, bits of colored cloth, carved figures whittled during long hours of travel. Bonds formed quickly, as though the land itself urged them to cling to whatever joy could be found. By morning, they often parted without ceremony, yet their games lingered, carried forward in memory. Not every encounter was light-hearted. The trail demanded resilience, and stories often bore the weight of struggle. A woman whispered of her husband buried in a shallow grave along the Platte, her voice trembling only once before steadying again. Another traveler admitted he feared his wagon would not hold through the mountains. Such confessions were not met with judgment, but with silence, the kind of silence that speaks of shared understanding. On the trail, honesty carried no shame. The act of trading stories was as necessary as food or water. In the vast emptiness of the plains, words became nourishment for the spirit. They reminded each traveler that they were not moving alone through the silence, that their footsteps joined a larger procession of lives bound together by the same uncertain road. The telling itself was a kind of survival, a way of keeping memory alive in a place that might otherwise swallow it whole. Sometimes, the stories carried humor, lightening the air after heavy days. A man might tell of the mule that refused to walk unless bribed with apples, or of the child who tried to ride a pig at a rest stop. Laughter rose quickly in those moments, surprising even those who had forgotten what it felt like. The sound drifted across the grasslands, startling the nightbirds, warming the hearts of those who listened. Humor was not frivolity, it was defiance, a reminder that joy could still exist, even when the land stripped everything else away. Songs, too, were shared. A fiddle appeared from one wagon, its bow scratching out melodies remembered from the east. Another voice rose in a hymn, low and steady, carrying through the air like a prayer. Children clapped their hands, couples swayed gently, and the prairie seemed to lean closer to listen. Music filled the spaces between words, carrying emotion where language faltered. For a few precious hours, the campfire circle became more than survival. It became celebration. The strangers who passed were not always destined to remain so. Some families found their paths aligned for days, even weeks, their wagons moving together as if bound by unseen threads. Partnerships formed in the dust. One wagon might lend an axle when another broke. Another might share flour when supplies grew thin. Trust, fragile at first, deepened with every mile. In the face of endless uncertainty, companionship became its own form of wealth. Yet the trail was restless, and not all meetings lasted. One morning, a family would turn their wagons north, chasing a different rumor of better grass, while another pressed westward without pause. Goodbyes were brief, often no more than a wave, a final glance over the shoulder. But the stories lingered, carried forward like invisible cargo. The faces of those met only once could be recalled months later, their words resurfacing in the monotony of the road. Even the landscape bore witness to these exchanges. The ruts cut into the earth by countless wagons overlapped, weaving paths of lives that had brushed against one another and then moved apart. The trail itself became a kind of memory, etched not only into soil, but into the minds of those who followed it. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every whispered grief became part of the larger story written across the plains. There was a strange intimacy in speaking to those who might never be seen again. Freed from the weight of permanence, travelers shared truths they might have hidden elsewhere. Confessions fell easily into the night air, regrets about leaving home too quickly, fears about what waited in the mountains, doubts about whether the journey was worth the cost. Strangers listened without judgment because they understood that on the trail, honesty was the only currency that mattered. The prairie wind carried these stories away, scattering them across the land. Yet even as they drifted, they remained. Words spoken into the fire did not vanish. They became part of the road itself, woven into its silence. And so every new story traded was not only for the listeners around the flames, but for the trail itself, which seemed to absorb the voices of all who walked it. As days blurred into weeks, the act of meeting and parting became as natural as sunrise and sunset. Strangers arrived, shared their lives, and moved on, leaving behind echoes that endured long after the wagon tracks faded. The trail was not just a road across the continent, it was a living archive, built from the countless stories that passed along its length. Each traveler carried some of those voices forward, adding them to their own, ensuring that no story truly vanished into the dust. And so the road stretched on, filled not only with the weight of wagons and the cries of animals, but with the voices of those who travelled it. In every campfire glow, in every whispered tale, in every shared laugh or tear, the Oregon Trail became more than hardship. It became a place where strangers, for a fleeting moment, became companions, and where the endless horizon, for all its emptiness, was filled with the richness of human memory. The prairie had already tested the patience of travelers with its vast distances, its winds that whistled without pause, and its monotony that stretched across the senses until time itself seemed to thin out. But nothing along the trail could quite halt the steady crawl of wagons like the wide, stubborn veins of water that cut across the land. Rivers were not simply obstacles. They were living presences, shifting moods of nature that no map could fully tame, and no preparation could entirely master. For those who had been lulled into a rhythm of dust, grass, and endless sky, the sudden sight of glimmering water broke the horizon like an unexpected test. Families would crest a rise and see the ribbon of blue or brown winding across their path, and the air itself seemed to tighten. Conversation lowered, wheels creaked slower. Even the oxen seemed to sense the hesitation in their master's hands. For a trail that demanded constant forward motion, rivers were where the pace faltered, and decisions weighed heavier than iron. Many emigrants had read pamphlets in Missouri, or listened to the confident words of guides in frontier towns who spoke of fords, shallow places where a wagon could cross safely if managed with care. But what those guides rarely captured was the mercurial nature of rivers themselves. A shallow ford in May might be a drowning hazard in June after rains swelled the current. A gentle stream in morning could rise by evening with runoff from unseen storms miles away. Travelers soon learned the hard lesson that rivers did not stay still, and the same crossing could never be trusted twice. At camp on riverbanks, the air would hum with debate. Some argued for caution, to wait and see if the water would drop. Others urged haste, fearing the delays that meant dwindling supplies later on. Men walked into the current, their trousers clinging to their legs as they prodded the bottom with poles, measuring not just depth, but firmness of footing. Silt and sand could betray even the surest oxen, swallowing hooves until beasts panicked, dragging wagons sideways into disaster. The prairie wind, so constant in other places, often seemed to pause here, as if even nature held its breath. For emigrant children, rivers carried a double image, playful and terrifying. To young eyes, the rippling surface promised relief from heat and dust, a place to splash and cool blistered skin. But parents, hardened by tales of drownings told around the trail's campfires, watched closely, eyes sharp with worry. The names of rivers, Platte, Sweetwater, Green, Snake, became whispered with the same gravity as distant mountain passes, for each held its own hazards. Crossings were not uniform affairs. Some were shallow enough for oxen to wade, while wagons rolled steadily through, wheels cutting dark trails beneath the surface. Others demanded ingenuity. Families lashed wagons together to create makeshift rafts, floating possessions across while beasts swam beside, snorting and churning the water. Men stripped down and ferried goods in smaller loads, their bodies straining against unseen currents. And there were always stories, true or embellished, of wagons swept downstream, children lost, food barrels split open and carried away by the relentless pull of water. Each tale reminded listeners of the fine line between progress and tragedy. Riverbanks often became crowded scenes. Dozens of wagons might gather, forming temporary villages of frustration and planning. Smoke from many fires rose together, and strangers traded advice, warnings, and guesses at which bend held the safest passage. Here, human voices carried over the splash of water, blending with the creak of harnesses and the impatient lowing of oxen. The trail, which often scattered travelers into small clusters, condensed into a press of humanity at these crossings. Survival meant watching others attempt first, learning from their fortune or failure, and adjusting one's own gamble. Not all rivers resisted with brute force. Some played tricks instead. Their waters looked placid from shore, slow-moving and almost gentle, Yet beneath the surface lay shifting sands and hidden snags. Wheels might roll smoothly in at first, only to sink deeper halfway across, pulling a wagon sideways. Oxen would lunge, nostrils flaring, their weight dragging down the harness, while drivers shouted and cracked whips in frantic rhythm. The scene was never quiet. It was filled with splashing, shouting, the groaning of wood under stress, and the thin cries of fear from passengers perched high on wagon benches. To stand at the edge of a river crossing was to face the reality that no amount of planning could erase chance. Even seasoned guides admitted that each attempt carried risk. The stories of those who perished at rivers, memorialized by crude markers left on the banks, lent a ghostly weight to each approach. Names carved into wood or stone reminded those still living that they walked a line too easily crossed into misfortune. Many emigrants paused to pray, to gather themselves in silence, or to grip the hand of a child tighter before urging their wagon forward into the water. Food and possessions also took their toll here. In the rush of survival, barrels of flour or crates of tools could tip and sink, the current claiming not just supplies, but months of labor and preparation. Families sometimes stood on the bank, staring helplessly as their provisions bobbed away, carried downriver to vanish beyond bends. In such moments, silence settled heavier than grief, for all understood what such loss meant. Less bread in the weeks ahead, fewer tools to mend wagons, fewer blankets to shield against cold. Rivers measured progress in more than miles. They exacted payment in goods, beasts, and, too often, lives. Yet rivers were not only foes, they were also rare sources of water in a land where streams could vanish in summer heat. For all their danger, they nourished weary travelers and livestock. Camp along the banks meant buckets filled without endless digging, and the chance to wash away dust that clung like a second skin. Children laughed in the shallows, while women scrubbed clothes against rocks, their knuckles raw, but their spirits lifted by the rhythm of work. The same force that threatened also sustained, and the emigrants knew it, respecting the double-edged gift with a cautious gratitude. Nights by the riverside carried their own atmosphere. The firelight flickered on faces as conversations turned to whispered fears. Was the crossing tomorrow safe? Would the rains upriver change everything by dawn? The prairie, so often marked by restless wind, gave way to the steady, eternal sound of water moving past, never pausing, never sleeping. The river's voice was a reminder that nature cared little for schedules or hopes. It flowed as it always had, and emigrants were only temporary trespassers along its course. For some, rivers became moments of transformation. A family that survived a harrowing crossing together might find their bonds tightened, forged by the shared terror and relief of reaching the far bank. Strangers, too, became companions, united by the memory of helping push wagons free of mud or pulling a soaked traveler from the current. The Oregon Trail was long, and its challenges many, but rivers carved into memory with a sharpness few other moments matched. In journals left behind, emigrants described rivers with awe and dread alike. Some wrote of their beauty at sunrise, waters gilded in light, mist rising in cool tendrils. Others recorded only loss, the day their wagon tipped, the day their oxen drowned, the day they buried a child near the willow roots along a foreign bank. Each crossing wrote its own story, and the trail, long after the wagons passed, held those memories in silence. As the journey continued westward, travelers would encounter river after river, each one different, each one unyielding in its own way. By the time the plains gave way to mountains, the sight of water no longer brought only relief. It carried the weight of lessons learned, lessons in patience, in risk, and in humility before forces greater than any emigrant's will. The trail did not forgive arrogance, and nowhere did it remind travelers of that truth more clearly than where earth gave way to water, and wheels met the currents of rivers that refused to stay still. Every journey along the trail had its own soundtrack, and though voices rose and fell, though wind whistled across the grasslands and rivers muttered over their stones, there was one sound that never left the ear: It was the weary, rhythmic complaint of wood straining against wood, the slow, unrelenting creak of axles turning beneath wagons that carried both possessions and hopes. If the Oregon Trail had a hymn, it was not sung but groaned, rising from iron pins rubbing into sockets, from oak and hickory forced into ceaseless motion. At first, this creaking was almost unnoticed. Families who set out from the edge of settled country were filled with voices. Laughter, the shuffle of boots, the cries of children, the snorts of oxen. Noise filled the mornings and evenings so fully that the wooden groan of wagons was just another piece of the larger chorus. But days wore down spirits, and nights wore down silence, until all other sounds faded into background. Then, in the still spaces between conversations, the axle's voice grew louder, more insistent. It was the reminder of distance not yet traveled, and strain not yet relieved. Wagons were never silent machines. They were built of living material, wood cut from forests that once swayed in the wind, now reshaped into wheels, hubs, and beams. The trail tested this transformation daily. Sun baked them dry, heat swelling fibers until they cracked like old bones. Rain soaked them, swelling seams until wheels seemed to groan with each turn. Dust worked into every joint, grinding like a file, thinning wood, wearing iron. Every mile was both progress and erosion. Emigrants soon came to know the voices of their wagons as intimately as they knew the voices of their companions. A high-pitched whine might mean a wheel's hub had run dry, the grease worn away until friction sang sharp. A deep, steady groan hinted at weight, pressing unevenly, a load that needed shifting or a beam that had begun to warp. The clatter of iron tires loosening from wood rims announced a danger that could halt a family mid-prairie, forcing repairs while miles of grass rolled indifferent in every direction. Greasing the wheels became a ritual, as essential as eating or resting. Buckets of animal fat, tar, or whatever thick substance could be spared were carried in wagons for this purpose. Men crouched with rags and brushes, smearing grease into the hubs, hands blackened with the mixture, the smell sharp and sour. It was dirty, endless work, but necessary. Without it, the axles would grind themselves into ruin, leaving wagons stranded like carcasses on the trail. Children sometimes watched, learning the lesson silently. Progress required care for the smallest parts, not only the grandest hopes, but even with diligence, failures were inevitable. A wheel could shatter against hidden rocks. An axle could split under strain, its fibers snapping with a sound that sent a chill through any family listening. The sight of a wagon crippled along the path was not rare. Sometimes the owners managed a repair, felling a tree and shaping a crude replacement with hatchet and saw. Other times the wagon was abandoned, its contents divided among other families, if they had strength, or else left behind. Possessions scattered by wind and weather. The trail collected such remnants like scars. Travelers passing by might see a broken wheel half buried in grass, or a beam leaning, grayed by sun, and know that somewhere a dream had been forced to halt. The creak of wagons was not only mechanical, it carried emotion too. It was a sound that reminded emigrants of weight of food stored in barrels, of tools too precious to leave, of quilts and keepsakes wrapped against dust. Every creak was a reminder that the wagon bore more than wood could easily carry. And within the wagons themselves rode children and elders, their bodies jostled by each uneven turn, their eyes glancing nervously at the sound that followed them like a ghost. Night brought no true rest for the axles. Though the wheels stopped turning, the echoes of their groans lingered in memory. Travelers lay on blankets near fires, listening to wind, to coyotes, to silence. And in that silence, many swore they still heard the phantom creak. It became part of them, as if the journey itself imprinted its sound on their bones. The Oregon Trail was measured not only in miles, but in the groaning chorus of wagons that pressed relentlessly west. Repair became as much a part of the trail as walking. Alongside graves and discarded belongings, one of the most common sights recorded in journals was emigrants stopping to tend to wheels. Hubs were wrapped with strips of leather when wood split, spokes wedged tighter with wooden pegs. rims hammered back into place with stones when iron bands loosened. Families became blacksmiths, carpenters, and inventors out of necessity. Each repair was a negotiation with time, enough to last another day, another mile, perhaps enough to carry them to Oregon. Oxen, too, responded to the creaking. Some beasts grew stubborn when the groans grew sharp, refusing to pull until the sound was lessened. Others ignored it, trudging forward in dull patience. Emigrants often treated these animals with a mixture of dependence and frustration, yet they knew that without oxen, the wagon's creaks would become final, immobile silence. The bond between beast and machine was undeniable. Each groan from the axle echoed by the lowing breath of the oxen dragging it. The monotony of the sound worked its way into memory, blending with the dust and hunger until it became inseparable from the journey itself. The creak was not merely noise, it was time passing, progress measured, a wheel turning toward mountains still unseen. When emigrants wrote in diaries at night, many described it in the same words they used for wind or rain. It had ceased to be machinery, it had become landscape. And yet, in quieter moments, there was an odd comfort to it. The groaning wheels meant the wagon was still moving, that the long road continued. Silence, by contrast, carried dread. Silence meant a break, a failure, a wagon lamed on the trail. As much as the sound grated on ears and nerves, it was also assurance. The creak was steady, reliable in its own weariness. In the endless uncertainty of the journey, that small certainty mattered. The Oregon Trail was not paved with stone or lined with rail. It was beaten by wheels, scarred by axles, worn into existence by the very sound that haunted those who traveled it. Each wagon added its note to the chorus, and though many fell silent along the way, others carried on, until the creak became the anthem of thousands. Generations later, the remnants of broken wheels would still lie buried in grass and soil, faint reminders of that slow song of wood and iron. Those who walked beside the wagons sometimes shifted their pace to its rhythm, footsteps matching the groan and turn, as though their bodies had joined the same weary orchestra. Even in exhaustion, even in despair, they found themselves in tune with it. The sound became a reminder that they were part of something larger than themselves, something moving forward despite resistance. And always, as the days stretched into months, the sound followed. Over rivers, across plains, up inclines toward mountains, the wagons creaked. They creaked through storms and under blazing suns. They creaked past graves, past abandoned trunks, past the fading confidence of some and the stubborn faith of others. Long before the travelers saw Oregon's valleys, they carried with them this one enduring companion, the slow, steady creak of wooden axles, marking the distance between where they had begun and the unknown still waiting ahead. The trail had a way of shifting its character with each horizon, and after the rivers and the constant groan of wagons, there came a new presence that filled the land, not with silence or water, but with movement so vast it seemed to ripple the very surface of the earth. Travelers who once thought the prairie endless in its emptiness soon discovered it was not empty at all, for across the grasses, across the swaying sea of green and gold, moved the dark, restless shadows of buffalo herds. They did not appear all at once. At first, it was a few shapes far off, small as stones on the horizon, but growing with each passing hour, then more, until the line stretched further than the eye could follow. The air itself seemed to vibrate when they came near, hooves striking soil in unison, sending tremors through the ground. It was a reminder that the trail was not theirs alone. Other lives had called these plains home, long before wagon wheels cut their shallow scars into the earth. For emigrants who had known only farms, barns, and small-town roads, the sight was overwhelming. Some wrote of it with awe, describing the buffalo as if they were a living ocean, a tide that rolled in grass instead of water. Others felt unease, for the sheer number of animals dwarfed human presence. To walk beside a wagon and see the earth shifting with tens of thousands of dark bodies was to be reminded of one's fragility. The land did not belong to the emigrants. Not yet, not truly. It belonged to the buffalo and to the people who followed them. The herds carried with them a weight of sound unlike anything else on the trail. From afar, it was a hum, like distant thunder. Up close, it became a steady pounding, hooves drumming against soil with the rhythm of inevitability. Wagons halted when the herds drew near, for no ox, no horse, no man could stand against that tide. Travelers learned patience, waiting for the living flood to pass, counting the minutes, sometimes hours, until the last stragglers vanished into grass and dust. At night, when the campfires burned low, families could still hear them in the distance. The low, rumbling calls of the animals drifted over the plains, mingling with the creak of wagons and the whisper of wind. Sleep came lightly when the earth itself seemed to tremble with each shift of the herds. Children pressed close to their parents, both frightened and fascinated, while men kept a wary eye on oxen, who often grew restless when the scent of buffalo lingered in the air. Not all encounters were from a distance. At times, the herds crossed the very path of the trail, close enough that emigrants could see the rough, shaggy coats and the dark eyes of animals that seemed both wild and timeless. Some men, rifles in hand, saw opportunity in this abundance. Meat was always welcome on a journey where rations dwindled and a single buffalo could feed a family for days. Yet the kill was never as simple as hunger suggested. Wounded buffaloes sometimes turned fierce, charging with a power that shattered wagons or scattered teams of oxen. More than one emigrant bore scars from the attempt to take food from the moving shadow of the plains. But the greater danger was not from a lone beast. It was from the herd itself. A spooked buffalo could set off a stampede, and a stampede was nothing less than chaos given shape. The ground thundered, wagons rocked, oxen bolted, and men shouted against a tide no voice could command. Families clutched at their wagons, children screamed, and all prayed that the rushing tide would pass them by. In the aftermath, silence felt sharper than before. Broken wagons left as proof that the trail was never without risk. For some emigrants, the herds inspired not fear, but reverence. They marveled at the abundance, at the way the animals moved as one, at the sense of continuity that stretched further back than memory. To see the buffalo was to glimpse the land as it had always been, untouched by fences, unmeasured by surveyors' tools. The emigrants' wagons marked change, but the buffalo marked endurance. They had been here before the wagons, and many wondered if they would still remain long after. Buffalo also shaped the rhythm of the trail in subtler ways. Where herds had grazed, the grass was flattened, sometimes cleared entirely, leaving paths that wagons could follow more easily. Where they wallowed, dust rose in great patches, coating wagons and travelers alike. Their bones, scattered across the prairie from hunts and winters past, became markers along the trail, pale reminders of lives lived and lost in this wide land. Children sometimes played with them, lifting horns or skulls as curiosities, while their parents regarded them with quieter thoughts about mortality. The presence of buffalo also meant encounters with people who depended upon them. Native tribes whose lives were interwoven with the herds watched the emigrants with wary eyes. The buffalo were not just animals, they were food, clothing, tools, and tradition. Every herd that moved, every carcass left behind by emigrants' rifles, carried consequences for those who lived upon the plains. Travelers who thought of the animals as mere obstacles often failed to see the larger web of survival into which they had stepped. There was a rhythm to these encounters. Herds appeared, passed, and vanished, leaving silence heavy in their wake. Wagons moved on, but the memory lingered. Diaries written by tired hands often paused to describe the day. The ground itself seemed alive. The day the horizon turned dark with moving shapes. For emigrants who reached the mountains and looked back on their long journey, it was not always the rivers or storms they remembered most vividly. It was the buffalo, and the way their shadows moved like clouds across the endless plains. In time, as the trail grew busier, as more wagons carved their scars into the land, the buffalo began to thin. Hunters, emigrants, and change itself chipped away at the vast herds. Yet in the era of the great migrations, when families still pressed westward in hope, The animals remained a presence so large it seemed eternal. For the emigrants walking beside creaking wagons, the buffalo were not just beasts of the prairie. They were a reminder that they were small figures in a larger story, that the land was not waiting empty for their arrival, but was already alive with shadows older and deeper than any trail. The creak of wheels returned once the herds passed, and the oxen leaned once more into their burdens. But the echo of hooves lingered, carried in the bones of the emigrants, a sound that would never quite fade. The Oregon Trail was a journey written not only in dust and distance, but in the moments when the earth itself seemed to move beneath them, carried forward by buffalo shadows across the plains. As the days stretched long and the prairie pressed endlessly forward, the nights became their own kind of landscape, softer but no less demanding. When the last wagon wheel had stilled and the final oxen had been unyoked, a hush spread across the encampment. The fires crackled, the kettles hissed, and beyond the dim circle of flame, the world opened into a vastness even greater than the plains themselves. Overhead stretched the lantern sky. Stars spread so thickly they seemed like a river of light, unbroken and eternal. For emigrants who had come from towns where lamplight dimmed the heavens, the sight could feel both comforting and unsettling. The sky was so immense that it seemed to press down, its weight of brilliance almost unbearable. Families would sit around the fire, their voices low, their bodies tired, and lift their eyes to the stars as though searching for familiar constellations to anchor them. Yet many confessed that the sky out here was unfamiliar, its patterns sharper, its expanse too wide to tame with simple names. It was no longer a backdrop, it was an endless companion. Nights on the trail carried a rhythm all their own. By day, the creak of wagons and the press of labor consumed thought, but after sundown, minds loosened in the dark. Stories flowed more easily, whispered across firesides, mingling with smoke and drifting upward. Men spoke of lands ahead, of mountains they had yet to see, while women remembered the homes they had left behind, kitchens lit by softer lamps, gardens tended in spring, children drowsed by the fire's glow, their dreams already carrying them to imagined destinations. The night became a gathering of memory and hope, a pause that bound them together. The prairie, so restless with wind and daylight, seemed calmer by night. The grass whispered more gently, as if tired too, and the constant dust settled at last. Yet the silence was never total. Coyotes called from the distance, their voices carrying across the openness, eerie in their persistence. Sometimes the sound made oxen shuffle nervously, and guards walking the perimeter of camp tightened their grip on rifles. But most nights, the calls became simply part of the score, as ordinary as the murmur of water or the rustle of leaves. Light, too, shifted in character when the sun fell. Fires lit the camp, but their glow was fragile, their reach small against the immensity of dark. Shadows gathered at the edges of vision, deep and uncertain. Families stayed close to the wagons, unwilling to stray too far into the vast unknown that pressed against them. Even the bravest felt a prickle of unease beyond the firelight. For the prairie by night belonged to something older than human settlement, a place where sight faltered and imagination thrived. Yet for all its unease, the night also carried comfort. The lantern sky was steady, unchanging. Travelers came to measure their progress not just by the ruts in the soil, but by the stars overhead. The moon became a familiar companion, its cycle a reminder of time's steady march westward. Some nights it hung heavy and golden, bathing the prairie in a pale glow that seemed to stretch forever. Other nights it vanished, leaving only the cold brilliance of stars, sharp enough to make one feel small. In these moments, the emigrants often turned inward. Diaries were written by the flicker of firelight, their ink capturing the weary reflection of another day gone. Mothers mended clothes, their needles flashing briefly in the glow before vanishing into shadow. Men polished rifles, checked harnesses, or spoke quietly with their companions about the road ahead. Even in fatigue, the trail did not allow idleness. Nights were for repair, for preparation, for gathering strength. And yet, In between tasks, there was stillness, a rare stillness that belonged only to the hours beneath the stars. Sleep itself was uneven. Some found it easily, their bodies giving way to exhaustion the moment they lay down. Others lay awake, eyes fixed on the darkness above, thoughts wandering far beyond the prairie. The cries of a baby, the shuffle of restless oxen, or the murmur of nearby voices kept many from true rest. And yet, fatigue pressed down relentlessly, ensuring that even those who feared the night eventually succumbed. Dreams were filled with both hope and dread. Some saw green valleys ahead, rivers gentled into silver streams, homes waiting at the end of the journey. Others woke startled, haunted by visions of broken wheels, of storms, of graves by the trail. The night carried all these possibilities, holding them in balance as fragile as the flame of a lantern against the vast dark. The social life of the trail often bloomed most vividly at night. By day, sweat and dust left little room for conversation beyond commands and necessity. But in the soft hours after supper, when bodies loosened and voices grew gentle, bonds formed. Families who had been strangers at the start of the journey grew close here, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. Songs were sung in low tones, hymns and ballads drifting upward, thin but sincere, carried into the endless sky as though the stars themselves were listening. There was always the awareness, however, that these nights, no matter how gentle, were never entirely safe. Fires were kept small, both to preserve fuel and to avoid drawing too much attention. Guards rotated quietly, their figures moving in and out of shadow, keeping watch against both man and beast. The presence of other people along the plains, sometimes friendly, sometimes not, reminded travelers that the dark could hold both comfort and threat. Each night was a gamble. Rest was necessary, but vigilance was survival. Still, the memory of these nights stayed with emigrants long after the trail was behind them. More than the heat of day or the endless dust, it was the vision of the lantern sky that endured. The sense of lying on the earth, weary and uncertain, with the heavens spilling open above. The stars, endless and indifferent, witnessed every hardship, every quiet prayer, every whispered word between companions. They were the one constant on a road filled with change and uncertainty. Children remembered these nights as a kind of wonder, lying awake beside their parents and tracing patterns in the stars. Parents remembered them as a time of fragile peace, a pause in the struggle, when for a few hours the burden of the road lifted enough to breathe. And the elderly, those who had seen many seasons already, often sat longest by the fire, their eyes reflecting the glow of both flames and constellations, perhaps wondering if they would live to see the journey's end. In the morning, the stars would fade, replaced by the unbroken light of day, and the trail would call once more. The creak of wheels, the groan of axles, the press of distance would return with full weight. But for those who walked the Oregon Trail, the memory of nights beneath the lantern sky lingered, as a reminder that even in hardship, there was still beauty. The journey was not only measured in ruts carved into soil, but in the fleeting wonder of looking upward, surrounded by silence, beneath a sky vast enough to hold both dreams and fears alike. The nights beneath the stars gave a kind of quiet comfort, but as morning always returned, so too did the daily reckonings with food. Along the trail, hunger was a constant shadow, trailing the emigrants step for step, not always sharp, but never far away. At first, families had left Independence or St. Joseph with wagons full, barrels of flour, sacks of dried beans, bacon wrapped in cloth, and coffee packed into small tins. The sight of supplies stacked neatly gave assurance in the early weeks, a feeling that perhaps the road would be manageable if only they rationed carefully. Yet as the miles lengthened, the supplies shrank, and hunger began to whisper more loudly with each passing day. Meals on the trail rarely filled anyone. Cornmeal cakes fried in bacon grease, thin soups stretched with more water than substance, or hardtack softened in coffee became daily fare. At first, children complained, longing for pies or warm bread. But soon enough, even they learned to accept that the trail was no place for feasts. The monotony of the diet wore on the body as much as the scarcity. Men grew thin, their belts tightened, and women rationed their own portions so that children might have a little more. Hunger was not always an empty stomach. It was often the quiet ache of never quite having enough. There were times when the land seemed to mock them. Herds of buffalo grazed in the distance. Antelope darted across the horizon. Birds scattered by the hundreds, and yet catching them was no simple task. Rifles were not always accurate. Powder and shot were limited, and time itself was a luxury. A caravan could not halt for long so that one man might chase a deer. Even when the hunters returned with success, the work of butchering and drying meat was exhausting, and fresh meat spoiled quickly in the relentless heat. More often than not, families passed by life teeming all around them, their mouths dry, their stomachs hollow, unable to turn what they saw into sustenance. For many, the greatest enemy was not the empty road, but the dwindling barrels. The flour, once a comfort, grew sour with mold if the weather turned damp. Bacon, salted heavily to preserve it, went rancid in the heat of summer. Beans, cracked and hardened, sometimes refused to soften even after hours of boiling, leaving them nearly inedible. Coffee, that precious stimulant for weary bodies, disappeared too quickly, leaving only bitter substitutes made from roasted corn or scorched chicory root. Every meal became a negotiation between what remained and how long it had to last. Water, though not food, shaped hunger as well. At times, the emigrants found clear streams where kettles could be filled, but other times they dug shallow pits in dry creek beds, waiting for a trickle of muddy water to seep through. Without water, cooking was impossible, and hunger grew sharpest when meals could not even be boiled. Stomachs ached, not just with emptiness, but with thirst, the two gnawing together. Children cried at night, lips cracked, and mothers rocked them silently, unable to offer more than a damp rag to soothe their mouths. Some turned to foraging, bending low in the grass for wild onions, plucking berries when they were found, or digging for roots that might stretch a stew. Yet such luck was rare. Many plants on the prairie were unfamiliar, and more than one emigrant sickened after trying to eat something the land had never offered as food. Hunger forced risks that a full stomach would never have entertained. Even when food was shared, it was never without calculation. A neighbor who offered flour one night might expect repayment later in beans or coffee, if not in coin. To refuse was unthinkable. On the trail, survival often hinged on generosity. But every gift carried weight. Families remembered who had fed them in lean times, and who had hoarded when others starved. The bonds of the wagon trains were tested most fiercely when hunger set in. It was the children who revealed hunger most plainly. Their play grew quieter, their steps slower. Eyes once bright dulled into watchful gazes as they noticed every morsel set on a plate. Parents gave up portions so their children might eat, but the little ones saw more than they were told, watching as fathers took smaller helpings, or as mothers pretended to be full after only a few bites. Hunger was a teacher, early and unrelenting, shaping childhoods with lessons of scarcity that would not be forgotten. There were darker tales, too, of animals sacrificed when rations ran low. Dogs that had once guarded the wagons or pulled small carts were sometimes slaughtered in desperation. Oxen, the very beasts that pulled the wagons, were butchered if disease struck them down or if their strength gave out. Few spoke openly of such meals, but hunger made necessities that pride could not erase. Each bite carried both relief and sorrow, for eating meant acknowledging what had been lost. Nights were the hardest. By day, the press of labor distracted the mind, but at night, when bodies lay down to rest, the ache of emptiness grew sharper. Stomachs growled in the stillness, and sleep came only in fits. Dreams carried visions of bread rising in warm ovens, of roasted meat and sweet preserves, of tables spread with butter and cream. Some woke with tears on their faces, for the dream had been more generous than the waking world. Hunger slowed the wagons. Weakness made it harder to yoke oxen, to lift barrels, to walk the miles that stretched endlessly ahead. Tempers grew shorter, arguments flared over small things, whether a biscuit had been divided fairly, whether a pot of beans should be shared. Hunger gnawed not only at the body, but at patience, dignity, and hope. Even faith, for some, wavered in the face of relentless need. Yet others clung more tightly to belief, praying over each meal, no matter how meager, as though giving thanks for scarcity might stave off despair. Hymns sung at night took on new meaning when sung by hollow voices. A whispered prayer over a pot of thin soup could feel like a shield, however fragile, against the fear that tomorrow might bring nothing at all. And still, there were small mercies. A rabbit snared by chance, a clutch of eggs found in tall grass, a patch of wild berries discovered just when hope had begun to fray. These were remembered more vividly than feasts back home, for they arrived like miracles. Children laughed again, sticky with berry juice, their hunger eased for a brief time. A single rabbit, shared among a dozen, tasted sweeter than any roast of old. The prairie taught its lessons without pity. Hunger was not always dramatic, not always famine, but a constant erosion of strength and comfort. It stripped away illusions of abundance and replaced them with endurance. Families pressed forward not because they were full, but because they had no choice. The road stretched on, and to stop was to starve entirely. When travelers wrote of these days, they often mentioned hunger only in passing, as though reluctant to give it more space than necessary. Yet between the lines of their journals, the truth lingers. The trail was not only a test of courage or strength, but of how long a person could walk with an empty stomach, how far they could push with nothing but hope to feed them. And so, along the endless road west, hunger became another companion, silent, invisible, but always present at the edges of campfires, in the rattle of empty barrels, in the long pauses between meals. It was a reminder that life on the Oregon Trail was as much about endurance as about discovery, as much about what was left behind as about what might one day be found. The prairie had its own way of reminding travelers that the land belonged to no one. Some days it seemed endless and gentle, warm winds brushing tall grass, skies so wide they looked like oceans turned upside down. But such calm was never permanent. Storms came without invitation, sudden and vast, overwhelming both earth and sky until nothing seemed certain but the force of nature itself. For those who had grown up with the more predictable seasons of towns and farms, the violence of the trail's weather felt almost otherworldly. It often began with silence, the kind that made even children pause in their play. Birds stopped their chatter, oxen lifted their heads uneasily, and the air grew thick, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, far on the horizon, clouds rose like dark mountains, swallowing sunlight until the land dimmed in an unnatural twilight. What had been a bright morning could turn into an ominous dusk within minutes, as though time itself had been unsettled. The first gusts of wind carried dust with them, stinging eyes and blinding those who strained to keep the wagons moving. Canvas covers snapped sharply, ropes groaned, and every loose item became a potential projectile. Men shouted above the rising roar, urging the oxen to steady, while women clutched children close and pulled them beneath wagons. A storm on the trail was not something to watch from a distance. It was a force that enveloped the emigrants completely, turning their ordered caravans into fragile clusters of wood and canvas beneath an indifferent sky. Thunder followed, rolling across the plains in waves so deep it shook the ground beneath their boots. Lightning fractured the heavens, jagged veins of light stretching for miles in a single heartbeat. Some strikes seemed to touch the horizon. Others cracked so close that sparks lit up the tall grass and frightened livestock into panicked bolts. To calm an oxen team in the middle of such violence was as desperate a task as any the trail demanded. A runaway wagon could mean broken wheels, shattered supplies, or worse. Rain, when it came, was not the gentle rhythm of a summer shower. It fell in torrents, drumming against wagon covers, flooding fire pits, and turning the hard earth into rivers of mud within moments. Streams swelled and overflowed, Once dry gullies became torrents, and crossings that had seemed simple in the morning became deadly by afternoon. Families huddled beneath their soaked canvas shelters, trying to keep bedding dry, though most failed. Blankets became heavy with water, clothes clung coldly to shivering skin, and the chill seeped into bones. The prairie, endless and open, offered no true refuge from the storm's reach. And yet, even as storms battered their bodies, there was a strange beauty in them. Children peeked from beneath wagon covers to watch lightning dance across the plains, awe mingling with fear. The sheer scale of the sky, so alive and unpredictable, gave even weary travelers pause. Some whispered prayers, others sang hymns to steady their spirits, and a few simply stared, wordless, at the spectacle of a world reminding them how small they truly were. But storms did not always come with rain. The prairie had other tempers, harsher still. Windstorms rose with such force that dust lifted in choking clouds, blotting out both sun and horizon. These storms swallowed the trail whole, leaving only a haze of grit through which wagon trains stumbled forward blindly. Dust filled mouths, coated skin, and reduced visibility to nothing. Oxen lowered their heads, straining against the gale, while people wrapped scarves or cloth over their faces to breathe. At times, travelers could not even see the wagon ahead, and progress halted entirely. Each family clutching tight to the certainty that their companions had not vanished in the storm's swirl. Hailstorms, too, struck without warning. Small stones of ice first, then larger, harder pellets that tore through canvas, bruised flesh, and left dents in wagon boards. To be caught in open ground with no shelter was to endure a bombardment from the sky itself. Livestock scattered and men threw themselves over children to shield them from blows. When the storm passed, wagons often bore scars, and families nursed welts as though they had been beaten. Tornadoes, though rarer, lived long in memory. Those who had seen them could describe the funnel clouds twisting down like black serpents, pulling earth and debris into a spiral that moved with terrible grace. There was no fighting such power, no cleverness or courage that could stand against it. Families dropped to the ground, clinging to each other, praying the storm would shift its path. Sometimes it did, unraveling harmlessly into the sky again. Other times it left wagons overturned, oxen scattered, and supplies strewn across the prairie like toys. Storms carried consequences long after they passed. Mud bogged wagons for days, forcing emigrants to lay branches beneath wheels or haul with double teams. Waterlogged supplies spoiled, and meals grew thinner. Livestock weakened from fear and lack of grazing when grass was drowned or burned by lightning fires. Storms were not brief interruptions. They were reshapers of the trail itself, carving new hardships into an already unforgiving road. The people themselves bore the wear of such encounters. Faces became gaunt not just from hunger, but from the exhaustion of wrestling against elements that seemed bent on their undoing. Sleep was broken when thunder shook the ground, or when the canvas flapped so violently it seemed it might tear away entirely. Mothers whispered lullabies to children through the clamor, their voices almost lost in the wind, but steady enough to reassure young ears. The human voice, fragile though it was, often became the only anchor against the immensity of storm and sky. Stories grew from these nights, not in the way of legends, but as quiet recollections shared by fires once the world calmed again. Someone would recall the time lightning split a tree only yards from where they stood. Another would describe a tornado that seemed to leap over their wagon as though sparing them deliberately. These stories were passed not as entertainment, but as reminders that they had survived, that storms, however terrible, did not always have the final word. And yet, there were those who did not survive. A wagon struck by lightning, a crossing swept away by sudden flood, a traveler caught too far from shelter when hail fell with the weight of stones. These losses were written into the trail with each mile. Graves dotted the road, some marked with carved names, others with nothing but a wooden cross or a pile of stones. Each was a reminder that storms had voices of their own, indifferent to prayer or plan. Still, the trail pulled them onward. when the skies cleared and the sun returned, steaming the wet earth and revealing once more the wide horizon, families rose from their soaked bedding, gathered what remained dry, and pressed forward. The prairie, as if nothing had happened, spread endlessly again, its grass waving beneath a calm blue dome. But for those who had endured, the land was no longer the same. The memory of storms lingered in every step, a reminder etched into bodies and minds that the journey west was never solely a contest with distance, but with the very elements of the world itself. There was a certain humility in such knowledge. The Oregon Trail was not only a road across soil, but a passage through sky and storm. The emigrants, no matter how determined, walked beneath a dome that could shift from benevolence to fury without notice. They were small within it, fragile against its force, yet they continued. The storms carried away not only calm skies, but illusions of control, leaving in their place a quieter, more enduring resolve. And so, as wagons creaked forward once more, the air still damp, the wheels still heavy with mud, the emigrants walked beneath a sky they would never again take for granted, one that could hold both promise and destruction in the same breath, one that had carried itself away and returned, leaving them to carry on with nothing but the will to endure. The plains had stretched so long, so endlessly, that when the land finally began to lift, some scarcely believed it. The horizon, once a straight line where earth met sky, now broke apart into jagged shapes, faint at first like shadows, then sharpening day by day until no one could deny that mountains stood ahead. To reach them meant the journey was nearing its great turning, but to climb them meant one final test, a weight that pressed on weary hearts even before the wagons tilted upward. For months, the land had seemed flat enough to trick the mind into forgetting the world could rise. Now, each step revealed a slope, gentle at first, then steeper, winding through valleys where streams ran swift and rocks broke the wheel's rhythm. The air grew thinner, carrying a coolness foreign to the prairie heat, a sharp reminder that the path forward was narrowing. Men leaned harder into the oxen's yokes, women steadied wagons over uneven stone, and children walked more slowly, their laughter silenced by the effort of climbing. The mountains had a way of humbling all who approached. They loomed not simply as obstacles, but as ancient sentinels, silent and unmoved by the struggle below. Their snow-capped crowns glistened even when the sun burned hot on the lower trails, as though they belonged to a season entirely their own. For emigrants who had never seen peaks so high, the sight carried awe and dread in equal measure. Some whispered that beyond those ridges lay the promise of fertile valleys, rivers, and towns. Others said nothing at all, saving their breath for the climb. The road narrowed into switchbacks carved by those who had passed before. Wheels groaned, axles strained, and every upward turn demanded patience. There was no rushing through the mountains. To move too quickly was to risk snapping a wheel on stone or tumbling a wagon into the ravine below. The oxen, ribs showing after so many miles, stumbled often, their breath clouding in the chill air. Yet still they pressed forward, urged by the steady rhythm of human voices calling them by name. Supplies weighed heavier now. Every barrel, every sack seemed to drag the wagons back down the slope, threatening to undo the progress of the climb. Families debated what to keep and what to cast aside. Cast iron stoves, once prized for their promise of warm meals, were left behind in gullies. Chests of clothes, chairs, and even books were abandoned when the road grew too steep. Each item left behind was a quiet admission that dreams had been heavier than the wagons could bear. Along the trail, relics of other travelers told the same story: broken wheels, scattered tools, heirlooms lying forgotten among the rocks. The mountains demanded tribute, and few passed without offering something of themselves. Nights were colder here. Fires sputtered against damp winds, and families huddled close, listening to the sound of rocks shifting in the dark. Coyotes howled from ridges above, their voices echoing eerily across valleys. Some nights the stars shone so brilliantly it seemed they could be plucked from the sky. Other nights, clouds swallowed everything, leaving only darkness and the uneasy knowledge that the trail ahead was hidden. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the creak of trees or the snap of branches that might have been animal or storm. And storms in the mountains were unlike those of the plains. Rain turned swiftly to sleet, coating the path in treacherous ice. Thunder rolled not across open skies but between cliffs, amplifying until it sounded as though the very mountains were splitting apart. Lightning struck peaks and ridges, illuminating the trail for an instant before plunging it back into shadow. For those caught in such tempests, progress halted entirely. Families crouched beneath wagons, praying their canvas covers would hold, while rivulets of icy water streamed down slopes into their camps. When morning returned, the land often looked altered. Rockslides blocked familiar paths, streams overflowed into once dry gullies, and mud swallowed wagon wheels to the hub. Each new obstacle felt personal, as though the mountains themselves tested whether the travelers were truly meant to cross. Yet still, the wagons moved, inch by inch, pulled by hands blistered and bodies too weary to remember what rest felt like. Amid the hardship, there were moments of stillness that no one forgot. Cresting a ridge to see valleys spread below, green and gold beneath the morning sun, gave a vision of why they had come so far. The air smelled different at such heights, pine and stone, sharper than the sweet grasses of the plains. Streams of snowmelt trickled cold and pure, and some drank deeply, claiming they had never tasted water so clean. Children played briefly in patches of lingering snow, laughing despite their hunger, their fingers numbed but their spirits lifted. The climb tested not only strength, but faith in the journey itself. Some began to question whether the promises of fertile land and better lives could truly lie beyond so harsh a barrier. Rumors spread of families who had turned back, too broken to continue. But for most, turning back was not an option. Behind them lay only the emptiness of months already endured. Ahead, however uncertain, lay the hope that the road would at last begin to descend. Injuries were common. Wagons tipped on narrow ledges, crushing supplies or worse. Oxen stumbled and fell, breaking legs that left them useless, their carcasses abandoned along the trail. Men strained their backs hauling loads up steep inclines, while women, their hands raw from rope burns, steadied wagons with nothing but grit. Death came quietly here, as it had on the plains, but with a swiftness sharpened by the mountain's dangers. Graves dug in rocky soil were shallow, marked by stones that travelers hoped would stand against the wind. And yet, for all its cruelty, the mountain crossing bound families more tightly than ever. Strangers lent oxen to neighbors who had lost theirs. Food was shared more freely, if only to keep another wagon from faltering. The road, narrow and unforgiving, demanded cooperation in ways the open prairie had not. To survive the climb was to owe as much to the hands beside you as to your own. At last, after days that felt like weeks, the road would crest. The final ridge, the last steep pull, revealed a sight that emigrants carried with them forever. The valley stretched below, vast and shimmering, a land that seemed to promise rest after endless toil. From that height, the horizon no longer mocked with its endless sameness. Instead, it opened with a sense of arrival, even if the road ahead was still long. Tears often came unbidden in such moments, the exhaustion of months giving way to a fragile relief. The mountains had not beaten them, though they had taken much in return. The descent was no easy gift. Wagons had to be chained so they would not race ahead of the oxen, their wheels groaning against the strain. Loose stones made every step uncertain, and steep slopes threatened to undo the relief of the summit. But even the dangers of going down felt different, lighter somehow, for gravity was at last pulling them toward the promise they had sought for so long. At night, in the first camps made in the shelter of the valley, fires burned warmer and the air felt thicker, easier to breathe. Meals were still meager, blankets still damp, but spirits lifted with the knowledge that the greatest barrier had been crossed. Some sang quietly, voices trembling not from fear, but from gratitude. The last mountain had been endured, and with its passing, the emigrants stepped into a new chapter of the journey, one that carried both hope and the weight of everything the road had taken. The mountains, towering behind them, remained etched in memory. Their storms, their silence, their cold. They were not simply obstacles left behind, but teachers, reminders that the road west was more than a line across a map. It was a pilgrimage of endurance, stripping away what was unnecessary until only the essential remained. And as the wagons rolled into the valley, wheels still creaking, bodies still weary, there was at last the faint sense that the trail was carrying them not just toward a place, but toward a tomorrow they had almost stopped believing in. The last great barrier had been crossed, though no one called it finished. The wagons, lighter now from all that had been abandoned, creaked into the valleys where the land opened wide again, softer, greener, shaped by rivers that wound like silver threads. The long months of dust and prairie, of storms that flattened the sky, seemed to blur behind them, yet the journey's weight clung to every step. What lay ahead was not simply distance, but the beginning of something entirely different. The edge of tomorrow, as uncertain as it was inevitable. The air felt changed. It was no longer the dry breath of endless plains, nor the thin sharpness of mountain ridges. Here the air was heavier, filled with the scent of pine and earth, carrying the promise of crops that could grow without struggle. The emigrants noticed it first in the soil that clung to their boots, darker and richer than any they had walked across for months. They bent to touch it, let it sift between their fingers, as though reassurance could be found in the very ground. Some whispered to children that this was the soil they would plant in, that bread would come from here, not from dwindling sacks. Yet the land, however generous it looked, did not erase the toll of what had come before. Faces were hollowed by hunger, clothes threadbare, shoes patched until little remained but strips of leather tied to weary feet. Wagons rattled with missing boards, canvas covers torn by wind and rain. Even in the gentler valleys, the scars of the trail showed plainly. Families walked in silence more often than not, saving energy for work still ahead. The dream of arrival, once spoken in eager voices at the journey's beginning, was quieter now, carried within like a fragile flame. Small towns and scattered farms appeared as the trail wound further west. For the first time in months, the emigrants saw smoke curling from chimneys that were not their own, heard the bark of dogs belonging to people who were already rooted. Such sights stirred a complicated ache. Relief mingled with envy, admiration with doubt. The road had made them wanderers. Now the world reminded them that others had already laid claim to the peace they sought. Not all welcomes were warm. Some settlers looked on the new arrivals with suspicion, fearing disease, fearing competition for land and water. Others offered kindness, bread baked in real ovens, milk still warm from cows, advice about the ground and weather. To those who had grown used to relying only on themselves and their wagon train companions, the presence of strangers was at once comforting and unsettling. It was proof that the trail could end, but also a reminder that an ending was not the same as belonging. There were choices to be made now. Each family measured what remained of their strength against the demands of the land. Some pressed onward, drawn by rumors of valleys richer still, rivers wider, towns more promising. Others stopped at the first plot of earth that seemed to offer shelter. A hillside became a claim, a meadow, a farm to be. A clearing, a place for a cabin whose walls would rise from logs yet uncut. Tomorrow began not in some grand ceremony of arrival, but in the quiet moment a family decided they would move no farther. The work of settlement was as exhausting as the trail, though it carried a different weight. Where once the days had been spent moving forward, now they were spent sinking roots into a soil both generous and demanding. Trees had to be felled, shelters built, fields cleared before winter returned. Men bent their backs to axes and plows. Women turned what little remained of supplies into the first meals cooked on new hearths. Children carried water from streams, gathered wood, or simply ran wide-eyed through spaces they could finally call home. The trail itself did not vanish. Ruts remained carved into the earth. Wheel marks hardened into lines that even years of rain could not erase. Abandoned possessions still littered its edges. Broken stoves, splintered crates, iron pots rusting in the grass. For those who had survived, the sight of such things stirred memories too heavy to voice. Every object was a story unfinished. The family who had left it, the reasons why, the question of whether they had reached this far. The road stretched behind them like a shadow, its silence reminding them of all it had taken. Winter was never far in thought. Even in the warmth of late summer, settlers looked to the mountains and wondered how snow might close the passes, how cold would creep into cabins not yet built. The valley might have felt like rest, but it was no final gift. The tomorrow they had reached demanded labor just as ceaseless as the road had. Yet this labor was different. It was work that stayed in place, work that promised, if endured, a return in spring. Some did not stay. Restless hearts, worn thin by months of movement, found it unbearable to settle so soon. They packed what little they had and pushed on, westward still, chasing rumors of rivers that glittered with gold, of lands untouched where no fences yet cut the earth. They vanished into the horizon much as they had arrived, carrying with them the endless hunger for what lay just beyond reach. For those who remained, there was a sense of watching stories branch away, uncertain which would carry fortune and which would dissolve into silence. And so tomorrow unfolded, not as a single moment, but as a scattering of beginnings. A plough striking root-choked earth, a roof rising log by log, a child laughing at the first sight of apples stolen from an orchard that had been planted by earlier hands, a family kneeling in prayer in front of a cabin that still smelled of sap and smoke. Each act was small, almost fragile, yet together they wove the fabric of a future where once there had been only road. The trail had reshaped them. Those who survived no longer carried the same hopes they had when leaving the East. Dreams had been pared down, stripped of extravagance, until only essentials remained. Food enough for winter, shelter enough for storms, soil enough to promise another harvest. Yet there was a strange strength in this simplicity. They had learned what they could endure, and that endurance itself became the foundation of the life ahead. The graves along the way did not vanish from thought. Names etched into wood or stone, places marked only by memory, lingered with each sunrise. Tomorrow carried with it not only the living, but the weight of those who had not reached it. In every meal shared, every roof raised, there was the silent presence of absence, a reminder that the cost of arrival had been dear. The land was fertile, but it had been watered with more than rain. Evenings in the valley felt different. Fires burned not for camps that would be struck at dawn, but for homes that would still stand come morning. The air hummed with crickets, with the low of cattle, with the steady work of life beginning again. Sleep, once broken by fear of storms and hunger, came easier here, though never fully without dreams of the road. Some awoke in the night still expecting the sound of wheels, the call to move on. Slowly, over weeks, those sounds faded into memory, replaced by the quieter rhythms of rooted life. Tomorrow was never the grand vision it had once seemed. It was harder, humbler, tangled with both gratitude and grief. But it was real, and that made all the difference. The wagons had carried them across deserts, rivers, storms, and mountains, stripping away everything unnecessary until only persistence remained. And persistence, in the end, was enough to turn a trail into a future. So the Oregon Trail, that endless line across the continent, did not truly end in one place or time. It ended wherever a family planted themselves, wherever a fire was built not for travel but for dwelling, wherever the road's dust gave way to the soil of tomorrow. And in that quiet, in the valley's first true stillness, the emigrants came to understand. The journey had never been only about reaching a destination. It had been about becoming people who could build a tomorrow from nothing but endurance, hope, and the land itself. And so, as our wagons settle at the edge of memory, the trail itself fades into quiet. We have walked through dust and hunger, through rivers that swallowed wagons whole, through the groan of axles and the lowing of oxen, through the loneliness of endless plains and the sharp ridges of mountains that seemed to test the very will of those who pulled themselves across. We have sat by fires where the only comfort was a hard biscuit softened in coffee, and we have looked at skies so wide and heavy with stars that they felt both like a promise and a warning. We have seen how lives were stretched thin by distance, how sickness could change the course of an entire company, and how every mile left behind also meant something that could never be returned to. That is what the Oregon Trail was. Not the roar of history, but its hush. Not the loud victories of generals or kings, but the quiet endurance of families, children, strangers walking together, pulling their lives across a continent. What they faced was not just the earth beneath their feet, but the unending weight of tomorrow, pressed into every choice they made. And as we close our eyes tonight, let me ask you, what part of this journey stayed with you most? Was it the sound of the wagons in the stillness of dawn, the cold waters of the rivers, or the dry, choking dust of the plains? Or perhaps the simple truth that the trail was not only hardship, but also hope, waiting in the valleys beyond. If this story has carried you a little closer to sleep, let it drift with you now, as steady as the wheels that turned across the prairie. And if you'd like more journeys like this one, quiet histories that move gently, step by step, through the forgotten corners of the past, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Your presence here keeps these stories alive, not in the noise of textbooks, but in the stillness of nights like this, where history becomes a companion. So, until the next path unfolds, rest well, and may your dreams be as endless as the trail.